Welcome to NTD News Today. Here are today's top stories. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth says the U.S. is winning decisively against Iran. He confirms the U.S. sank an Iranian warship in the first torpedo sinking since World War II. We have more on a Pentagon briefing this morning. NATO shooting down an Iranian missile headed into Turkish airspace, marking the first time the alliance member is drawn into the conflict. And Israel responds as Iran expands its strikes in the Middle East. Lawmakers emerging from a closed-door briefing on Iran with mixed feelings. Democrats pushing to restrict Trump's military authority in a vote today, a move House Speaker Mike Johnson says would play into the enemy's hands. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says that Trump's global 10% replacement tariff is set to rise to 15% later this week. Today is Wednesday, March 4th. I'm Stephanie Cox, and we are watching a live feed of Beirut, Lebanon, where, of course, there have been strikes and conflict since Hezbollah there, a terrorist proxy of Iran, struck Israel, and Iran has been striking as well, the site of much conflict as the strikes on Iran expand and the conflict widens. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth saying the U.S. is winning in the war against Iran. He says the U.S. will have complete control over the country's airspace in the coming days. The Secretary was speaking to a press briefing this morning along with General Dan Kane, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Take a listen.
I stand before you today with one unmistakable message about Operation Epic Fury. America is winning decisively, devastatingly, and without mercy. And we have only just begun to hunt, dismantle, demoralize, destroy, and defeat their capabilities, just 4 days in. Starting last night and to be completed in a few days, in under a week, the two most powerful air forces in the world will have complete control of Iranian skies, uncontested airspace.
Iran's theater ballistic missile shots fired are down 86% from the first day of fighting, with a 23% decrease just in the last 24 hours. And their one-way attack drone shots are down 73% from the opening days. This progress has allowed CENTCOM to establish localized air superiority across the southern flank of the Iranian coast and penetrate their defenses with overwhelming precision and firepower. We will now begin to expand inland, striking progressively deeper into Iranian territory and creating additional freedom of maneuver for U.S. forces.
Both officials say the U.S. military has enough munitions for ongoing operations against Iran, with Hegseth adding, quote, Iran cannot outlast us. He says more bombers and fighters will arrive today. Hegseth also saying that a torpedo from a U.S. submarine sank an Iranian warship. He did not reveal the name of the ship, but Sri Lanka announcing today at least 80 people were killed in a U.S. submarine strike on an Iranian warship.
Yesterday, in the Indian Ocean, and we'll play it on the screen there, an American submarine sunk an Iranian warship that thought it was safe in international waters. Instead, it was sunk by a torpedo. Quiet death. The first sinking of an enemy ship by a torpedo since World War II.
Hegseth also reporting that the military killed the Iranian leader behind an alleged plot to assassinate President Trump. He says that target was not the original focus of the war effort, adding that those responsible were eventually placed on the target list. Hegseth did not name the individual. In 2024, the U.S. Justice Department charged an Iranian man in connection with a plot to assassinate Trump, who was then president-elect.
We've known for a long time that Iran had intentions on trying to kill President Trump and or other U.S. officials. And while that was not the focus of the effort by any stretch of the imagination, in fact, never raised by the president or anybody else, I ensured and others ensured that those who were responsible for that were eventually part of the target list. We eventually had the opportunity to do that from the air.
Turkey says a missile fired from Iran was intercepted and destroyed by NATO defense systems. The incident marks the first time the alliance member has been drawn into the Middle East conflict. Turkey's defense ministry today saying the missile crossed airspace in Iraq and Syria before heading toward Turkey. NATO intercepted the threat before it entered Turkish airspace. Debris that fell in southern Turkey was identified as part of the interceptor missile. Officials report no casualties or injuries. Turkey warned that it has the right to respond to any hostile act and urged all parties to avoid further escalation, adding it will continue discussions with NATO and allied partners. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says there was no sense that the incident would trigger Article 5, which has only been invoked once before after the 9/11 attacks. Article 5 states that an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all members. Beijing has been buying nearly 90% of Iran's crude oil supplies, but since the recent U.S.-Israel strikes on Iran, oil exports coming through the Strait of Hormuz have come to a standstill. What are China's options here? NTD's Arlene Richards explains the Communist Party's dilemma.
The Chinese have a problem, certainly, with the strait being closed. They are buying discounted oil from the Iranian Ghost Fleet, which has benefited their economy at the expense of the United States of America for an awfully long time. But, Maria, there's something deeper. The Chinese have used Iran as their primary pillar of infrastructure in the Middle East. They've used it. The folks who killed 20,000, 30,000 people depended on Chinese technology to surveil their people, Huawei and Hikvision. The Chinese have used this to infiltrate throughout the Gulf Arab states as well. This has been their strategic footprint in the Middle East, and if taken down, we will have weakened the Chinese Communist Party's capacity to hold Americans at risk. This is big for the Middle East. It's big for Israel, but really important in what is really the true first major effort to take down a pillar of Chinese power.
On Tuesday, Beijing called for an immediate halt to U.S.-Israeli strikes in Iran.
Paired with the raid in Venezuela earlier this year, there's been a pretty significant impact on China's oil supplies.
For decades, the Chinese Communist Party has been a consistent buyer of Iran and Venezuela's crude oil. It ramped up purchases of Iranian oil to record levels 3 years ago amid talks between Iran and world powers to revive a 2015 nuclear deal that would have lifted significant sanctions on Iranian oil exports.
China gets somewhere between, let's say, 15 and 23% of its seaborne oil from Iran.
Since the strikes began on Saturday, Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow channel off of Iran's coast. Nearly 20% of global oil usually gets transported through the strait every day from several Gulf countries. But before the U.S.-Israel strike, the CCP was importing a little over 1 million barrels of Iranian oil per day, up from 700,000 barrels 3 years ago. The two countries had made a deal that gets around the multiple sanctions on Iran and saves Beijing $8 to $10 per barrel against benchmark pricing. Iran was bypassing the sanctions by shipping its oil through Malaysia and Indonesia. Their arrangement has saved Beijing billions of dollars annually and provided Iran with its primary revenue stream.
Donald Trump tightens the noose on the shadow fleet that has enabled all of that. The bigger target is actually communist China, which is increasingly in a box, is going to have to start buying its oil, the huge percentage of its oil, on the open market at full price.
Beijing was buying about 17% of its overall crude oil supplies from Iran and Venezuela. It buys another 18 to 20% from Russia, which accounts for nearly 50% of Russia's total crude exports. But what if the conflict drags on?
Right from the beginning, we projected 4 to 5 weeks.
Beijing has been stockpiling a significant amount of oil, and it had already begun ramping down its imports of Iranian oil in 2026 in exchange for more Russian oil. But Beijing has also been relying on other Middle East countries for oil, including the biggest supplier in the region, Saudi Arabia. Those exports also went through the Strait of Hormuz, which is closed. If Russia agrees to a peace deal with Ukraine, Beijing could lose another big oil supplier. Arlene Richards, NTD News.
And joining us now to break down the the effect that Operation Epic Fury could have on China. Our panelists, Keith Naughton, co-founder and principal at Silent Majority Strategies, and Rod D. Martin, foreign policy analyst and CEO of Martin Capital. Keith, Rod, thanks so much for joining us today. And I do want to jump right in. Some have called Iran a proxy of China, and of course, China's going through its own, perhaps parallel downfall, some commentators believe. Just to start with you, Keith, how do you see that relationship?
Well, I think it's a close relationship. I think that Iran does act independently quite often. I view it more as Iran being sort of an occasional cat's paw of China, but they do engage in activity that is not helpful to China. Closing up the strait also shuts off imports from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. There's also damage to Chinese investments in that region. I think it's humiliating for China that they really can't do anything about what's going on there. So the Iranians have kind of dragged them into this politically. So I think it's harmful to China. It's embarrassing to China. But for the most part, I think everyone would be better off if this regime were knocked out and you could have a more peaceful Middle East. All
right. And Rod, I want to get your take on that, and also this particular squeeze on China due to the attack on Iran coming just weeks before an expected meeting between Trump and Xi, and your thoughts on that.
Well, first, I just want to say that you guys are doing a better job of covering this aspect of it than anybody I know. And I really appreciate that, because this is the bigger story. The bigger story, as important as Iran is on its own, as important as Venezuela and Cuba are on their own, the big story is Donald Trump's tightening the noose around China's ambitions to expand. Its desire to attack Taiwan, its honestly desire to absorb large chunks of the Russian Far East and Siberia, its play to be a true global superpower is all on the line here, and it floats on a sea of sanctioned oil. So much of China's oil, nearly half of China's oil, is sanctioned oil that they're getting at a steep discount. They're taking about 40% of Russia's total exports. They're taking 90% of Iran's total exports. They were taking a huge percentage of Venezuela's, and that's going away, partly because of what has now happened in Venezuela and is now happening in Iran, but also because of the growing interdiction of the shadow fleet tankers that carry that oil. Without that shadow fleet, this oil never gets to China. And we were talking about this earlier in the week, that India is now actually helping us stop these shadow fleet tankers. So China's in a bind here. This is actually a pretty large financial sum that they're not going to be able to count on going forward. And it reduces their unfair trade advantages, their ability to project power. Everything comes back to Beijing. And that has been the Trump administration's primary focus.
What kind of acute symptoms do you expect to see from this squeeze in China now, Rod?
Well, the biggest single thing is, you can become rich one way or another. You can increase your income or you can reduce your expenses. This is a huge increase in China's expenses in an economy that's already struggling. This is a country where nearly everybody has put their retirement savings into real estate. The real estate market has been just a catastrophe since before COVID, and it's only going to get worse because China is facing significant population declines over the next several decades that at this point are just irreversible. So if the foundation of your economy is something that is actually now depreciating, and you have your expenses increase on the production side dramatically, that's a pretty bleak outlook for the next 25 years.
Within that context, Keith, I don't know if you have thoughts on what Trump and Xi may be gunning for in their upcoming meeting in the context of this squeeze on China.
Well, it's a very tricky situation because the CCP and Xi have to do something to reassert themselves on the global stage. And we don't know what it's going to be because they've proven to be helpless with Venezuela. That could be excusable. It's right in America's backyard. We had a very limited operation. But now with Iran, with them not doing anything, they're proving to be the worst allies in the world. Nobody can count on them. So the CCP has to do something to reassert China on the world stage. And this Trump meeting is going to be very curious. Do they cut some kind of deal with him and are able to claim some type of triumph? Are they able to insert themselves as some type of mediator in some way in this conflict? Or do they do something more aggressive, like in the against the Philippines in that South China Sea, where they're illegally claiming thousands of square miles of territory? So it's kind of a dangerous time where they've got to do something. I agree with Rod. They've got significant economic pressures, and this oil discount that they've been riding on, that's just something on the top with tariffs and declining population and the real estate bubble bursting and the fact that their economy is probably overstated by at least 30%.
Yeah, the regime will need to address this lack of energy input very soon. Do you think the attack on Iran could end up pushing China toward sourcing that more from Russia? Keith?
Well, I think they'll try. I mean, there's limited infrastructure from Russia into China. So that's a challenge for them, and limited shipping capacity. I think they will try to do that. But as we've seen, that's not necessarily good for the Russians, by the way, because the Chinese have cut some pretty tough deals with the Russians. So I think if China is going to demand more Russian oil, it's going to create an additional tension point because the Chinese are going to want a good deal and the Russians are going to desperately need more cash. So I don't think it really pushes them together. I think it creates a new tension point for them.
And Rod, you rightly pointed to the urgency here, especially regarding the economy, and yet also that aspect of the regime's kind of being shown for what it is, not reliable as an ally. At this point, how is that going to impact all of its relationships around the world, considering that it really does need to build them up, and it's been trying to position itself as a strong mediator, as a peacemaker, and now it's sort of being shown as nothing?
It's somewhere between nothing and utterly unreliable. Yes, if you're banking on China to be your friend, you are absolutely out of luck. It's worse than that. One of their industries they're really trying to get going is arms sales. And what we've seen in Venezuela and now in Iran is that their weapons are junk. Their air defense systems are worthless. You might as well just not have spent your money. And the Russian systems are just as bad. Now, does that mean they can't hurt you on a given day? Well, no, of course not. But American technology is just leaps and bounds ahead, and we seem to know how to actually use what we have, which they are not proving to be able to do. So that puts another crimp in their style. They want to increase income through arms sales. Who's going to buy their stuff? And same thing for Russia. So I think what you're going to see happen is we're going to get to a negotiated peace in Ukraine. The president is highly committed to this. Don't know how long it's going to take, but you're going to get there. And the result of that will be the reintegration of Russia into the global system. They will resume proper oil and gas exports at market prices, which cuts China off from its supply. And they will be in a position where they have to buy everything on the open market. That potentially puts their economy into a recession by itself.
Yeah, now earlier today, Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, said that the number of Iran's shots fired and one-way attack drones fell dramatically since the first days, 86% since the opening days of the assault. And one-way attack drones were down by 73%. Hegseth, when asked in that same meeting, said that there's no message for Russia and China in this conflict. But Keith, do you think what do you think they'll be reading into it?
Well, I think that's obviously good news. Iran has limited weaponry. They have limited ability to restock. I think they've been putting out this footage, and it's sort of like something out of the old Cold War where most of the footage is fake. It's a question of whether we've got the resolve to finish off the job with them. And it's a question of what is the resolution of the IRGC there and the fanatics in Iran to maintain their police state via violence and to continue this fight? And how long will that take? And what is their wherewithal? Those are unanswerable questions really right now. We won't know until that unfolds over the next couple of weeks. But I do think that we're going to see a continued degradation of the Iranians. Hopefully there will be a political change there, and they would accept a deal that would remove sanctions, bring them in the international community, and as a bargain, stop funding terrorism and stop funding their nuclear program. That would be hugely beneficial to the people of Iran. The last 40 years of policy by this fanatical regime have been a catastrophe for the people of Iran more than the rest of the Middle East.
And your final thoughts, Rod?
It cannot be stressed enough that there is hardly an armed conflict in the Middle East that isn't instigated, directed, funded, and armed by Iran. And as a result of that, if you shut off that problem, that cycle, that regime that is directing all these forces, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, take your pick, if you shut that off, it reduces the need for American forces in the Middle East, which also means we can focus more on China. So all of this is bad for China. None of this is good. And even when the Iranians are kind of at cross purposes with China, they're at least making a mess for us, which helps China. That's about to go away.
All right. Great to have both of you on today and hear your insights. Keith Naughton and Rod Martin, thank you so much.
Thank you.
A big debate coming to a head in Congress once again over the War Powers Act. Senate Democrats today pushing to stop U.S. military operations in Iran and prevent President Trump from taking further action without congressional approval. The expected vote comes after Secretary of State Marco Rubio held a closed-door briefing with lawmakers last evening to discuss the developments in Iran. NTD's Melina Weiskup has more.
The first vote in Congress on the Iran War Powers Act is happening later today in the Senate, but House Speaker Mike Johnson is also facing the possibility of the same vote being forced to the floor in the House, a move that he's described as dangerous.
Imagine a scenario where Congress would vote to tell the commander-in-chief that he was no longer allowed to complete this mission. That would be a very dangerous thing. You see that Iran is firing almost seemingly indiscriminately at targets. They're trying to intimidate America. They're trying to test our resolve.
The Speaker has insisted that this is an operation, not an official war. Therefore, Congress doesn't need to approve it. Last evening, Secretary of State Marco Rubio briefed lawmakers behind closed doors with the goal to reassure lawmakers that the administration's objectives were clear. The initial strikes aimed at wiping out Tehran's missiles and other military capabilities. While Republicans largely reiterated support for the administration's operation, many Democrats left that briefing with complaints, mainly over what they called a lack of planning and lack of congressional oversight.
They have shifting goals, different goals all the time, different answers every day, and I am truly worried about mission creep.
Now, to be clear, the administration has insisted that they do have clear objectives and strategies at play. But during a Pentagon briefing earlier this week, they said that they couldn't lay out for American people too many specifics to avoid tipping off the enemy. While most Democrats are questioning the administration, a few, including Congressman Greg Landsman of Ohio and Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, say the strikes were justified.
You know what? This was overall a good thing. You don't have to agree on everything. So I'm going to be honest. So, why can't you just acknowledge that one of the most evil people on the face of the earth was erased? That's a good thing.
Senator Lindsey Graham said that Iran made a miscalculation when it retaliated by striking several nearby countries, but he added that it's had a good effect and that it's driven other countries in the Middle East to become more involved in the fight for stability in the region.
The countries now are more intent than ever to end the threat forever. So what I see in the coming days is more capability directed at the regime that's non-American, more planes flying that are non-Americans.
While the administration has insisted that the initial goal here was not to force regime change, President Trump is encouraging the people of Iran to seize the day to establish a new government. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
And thanks, Melina, for that report. The State Department ordering non-emergency staff to leave Pakistan. And as Iran increases retaliation against U.S. sites, Washington is working to evacuate Americans from the Middle East as well. More on that after this. Welcome back. You're looking at a live feed of Beirut in Lebanon. And we are covering Operation Epic Fury. And the U.S.-Israeli operation in the Middle East is continuing, Israel launching a new wave of strikes targeting Iran and Lebanon today. In a post on X, the IDF said it struck a major paramilitary of Iran's Revolutionary Guard. It also targeted internal security command centers in Tehran. The IDF said the sites were used by the Iranian regime to maintain control across the country. In Beirut, massive explosions shook the city this morning. The IDF urged people to evacuate Beirut's southern suburbs, saying Israel would strike Hezbollah targets in the area. Iran and the Lebanese terrorist group Hezbollah launched a combined attack on Israel today. Interception trails were seen over the Tel Aviv area and loud booms were heard. Iran has fired regular missiles and drones at Israel, though most of the incoming fire has been intercepted. Meanwhile, American and Israeli forces say they're striking Iranian targets nonstop. Here's that story.
The U.S. military says it has hit nearly 2,000 targets so far as part of Operation Epic Fury. The head of Central Command, Admiral Brad Cooper, says the U.S. is ahead of the game plan.
We have severely degraded Iran's air defenses and destroyed hundreds of Iran's ballistic missiles, launchers, and drones. And in simple terms, we're focused on shooting all the things that can shoot at us.
Admiral Cooper also says the U.S. is going after Iran's Navy.
We are also sinking the Iranian Navy, the entire Navy. Thus far, we've destroyed 17 Iranian ships, including the most operational Iranian submarine that now has a hole in its side. For decades, the Iranian regime has harassed international shipping. Today, there's not a single Iranian ship underway in the Arabian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, or Gulf of Oman.
According to Cooper, Operation Epic Fury has involved several big moments for the U.S. military, including using long-range precision strike missiles for the first time and launching one-way drones which were originally based on an Iranian design. Cooper says there are more U.S. assets in the region than there have been in decades.
More than 50,000 troops, 200 fighters, 2 aircraft carriers, and bombers from the United States are participating in this operation, and more capability is on the way. These forces bring a massive amount of firepower, representing the largest buildup by the U.S. in the Middle East in a generation.
The White House is also providing updates on Operation Epic Fury, saying U.S. forces are hitting Iran surgically, overwhelmingly, and unapologetically. In a post on X, the White House said Iran continues to strike against military and civilian locations indiscriminately across the region. Meanwhile, the Israeli military says one of its F-35 stealth fighters shot down a piloted Iranian Air Force plane over Tehran today. Israel's ambassador to the U.S. gives updates about the joint U.S. and Israeli operation.
Today in Tehran, we took out the 4th of the 4 command centers, 3 we took out yesterday, creating chaos within the ranks of the Ayatollah regime. This creates a chink in the chain of command where they're not able to send messages down the system onto the field.
He said Israeli and U.S. forces also eliminated a covert underground nuclear compound.
The Department of War has identified 4 of the 6 American soldiers who died during Operation Epic Fury. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth addressing U.S. casualties during the press briefing this morning.
Much was made of the volume of missiles Iran was able to shoot in the first few days. And sadly, as we projected, a few got through and killed 6 of our best, who will hopefully arrive home soon. We will avenge them, no doubt.
The Pentagon yesterday announcing the deaths of Army Reserve Captain Cody Cork, Sergeant First Class Noah Tegens, Sergeant First Class Nicole Amore, and Sergeant Declan Cody. In a statement, the department said they were killed Sunday in Kuwait. The incident is under investigation. The United States Army Reserve expressed its condolences to the families. And our thoughts are with the families, too, and our appreciation of their service. U.S. government personnel are on the move. The State Department has ordered non-emergency staff and their families at consulates in parts of Pakistan to leave the country. The specific locations concerned are Lahore and Karachi. Pakistan shares a nearly 600-mile border with Iran. The department cited ongoing threats of drone and missile attacks from Iran, along with disruptions to commercial flights. Officials also warned of a risk of terrorist violence, including attacks and other hostile activity in Pakistan. Staff at the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad were not affected. Tensions escalated after at least 22 pro-Iranian demonstrators were shot and killed in Karachi after trying to storm the U.S. consulate. Tensions in Karachi escalated after violent clashes between protesters and security forces left at least 22 people dead and more than 120 injured. And with Iran increasing retaliation against U.S. sites, Washington is now working to ensure Americans leave the Middle East. Here's the update on that.
It's a lot of different things here that need to happen in order to move people.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio on Tuesday addressing the issue of Americans stranded in the Middle East as the ongoing U.S.-Israeli war with Iran expands across the region.
It'll be a variety of methods: charter flights, military flights and transports, expanded commercial opportunities, and in some cases land routes that will allow them to go to neighboring countries.
President Donald Trump suggesting Tuesday there was no evacuation plan in place because the war unfolded too quickly. Officials are urging Americans to contact the State Department if they are stuck overseas and need help.
It all starts by knowing that where you are and how we can get a hold of you.
This comes amid continuing attacks on Iran and more retaliatory attacks by Iran on Israel and against countries throughout the Middle East, including a U.S. consulate in Dubai and an airbase in Qatar, where officials say an Iranian ballistic missile struck the largest U.S. military installation in the region. There were no casualties.
President Trump is sharing his thoughts on who the next leader of Iran should be. Trump responding yesterday to a question about whether the exiled son of the late Shah Reza Pahlavi could be a possible leader.
I guess he is. Some people like him, and we haven't been thinking about too much about that. It would seem to me that somebody from within maybe would be more appropriate. I've said that. He looks like a very nice person, but it would seem to me that somebody that's there, that's currently popular, if there's such a person. But we have people like that. We have people that were more moderate. You know, these were radical lunatics, and you know what they get? They get nothing. All they do is kill people.
Pahlavi recently said he would want to lead Iran in a transition to democracy if the current regime collapses. Pahlavi's father was the last Shah of Iran before the 1979 revolution. He left the country amid increasing political tensions. His exit came as Ayatollah Khamenei returned from exile. Khamenei became the country's leader when revolutionaries overtook the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held dozens of Americans hostage for more than a year. And Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has a stark warning for any Iranian succession plans. He says anyone replacing the late Ayatollah Khamenei will be an unequivocal target for elimination. Katz says he and Prime Minister Netanyahu have instructed the Israel Defense Forces to prepare and act by all means as part of Operation Lion's Roar. That's Israel's ongoing military campaign against Iran and its proxies. The operation is being carried out alongside the U.S.-led Operation Epic Fury. Katz added that Israel and the U.S. will continue to act with full force to weaken Iran's capabilities. Israel says it aims to create conditions for the Iranian people to overthrow the regime and replace it. Coming up, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz testifying in a House probe on alleged fraud, how he responds to accusations of fraud and leadership failures. And Treasury Secretary Bessent saying Trump's 10% replacement tariff is set to rise to 15% later this week, following the Supreme Court ruling against his earlier duties. Those stories after this. President Trump is set to meet with the leaders of major tech companies, including Google, Meta, and OpenAI. The meeting's aimed at protecting consumers from rising electricity costs amid the rapid expansion of energy demand in data centers. And tech companies are investing billions in new artificial intelligence computing capacity that draws vast amounts of electricity. As November's midterm elections approach, voters are expressing concern about energy affordability and data centers straining the country's power grid. Trump announced what he called a ratepayer protection pledge in his State of the Union address last week. As part of the pledge, tech companies would commit to measures to ensure AI infrastructure doesn't drive higher utility bills for households and small businesses. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says tariffs could be on their way up. He says raising the temporary global import tariff from 10 to 15% will likely be implemented sometime this week.
And again, that's under something called Section 122, and that's a 150-day authority. And during that time, during the 150 days, we will see studies from U.S. TR on Section 301 tariffs, from Commerce on Section 232.
Bessent also predicted that by August, U.S. tariff rates would effectively return to levels seen before the Supreme Court struck them down. The court ruled last month that the president exceeded his authority by imposing tariffs. Trump then signed a new order under a different law for a global 10% tariff. And Minnesota Governor Tim Walz defending himself in a probe of alleged fraud. He's testifying before the House Oversight Committee today.
Federal prosecutors estimate that as much as $9 billion may have been stolen from just 14 Medicaid programs administered by the state of Minnesota. Those programs have cost taxpayers more than $18 billion since 2018, and investigators believe that half or more of that spending may have been lost to fraud. And that did not happen overnight. As our investigation has shown, it happened because state leadership failed repeatedly to intervene.
Although Minnesota's programs have overwhelmingly achieved their intended purposes, they're not immune from fraud. I'll be the first to acknowledge that. But let me be clear. In Minnesota, if you defraud public programs, if you steal taxpayer money, we'll find you, we'll prosecute you, we'll convict you, and we'll throw you in jail. In this anti-fraud mission, we keep good company. Across the country, our nation's governors work hard every single day to combat fraud in their programs. But even as we confront issues similar to our sister states, the people of Minnesota have been singled out and targeted for political retribution at an unparalleled scale.
The governor says he's committed to combating fraud and has created positions for this effort. He adds that Minnesota will do so without compromising assistance to those in need. He's also using the opportunity to voice his disapproval of the Trump administration's immigration enforcement operation in his state. Republicans on the committee accuse the Minnesota governor of a failure of leadership. They say the leaders of Minnesota failed to act despite repeated warning signs of fraud.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor, why didn't you tell the truth? Why didn't you just tell the truth about the Feeding Our Future program? This program, my understanding, received $3 million the first year. Within a couple years was getting $200 million of taxpayer money. Whistleblowers raised concerns. As the chairman said, auditors raised concerns. Everybody raised concerns. March 30th, 2021, the payments are stopped. And a little over a month later, the payments are restarted. Why didn't you tell the truth about why you restarted the payments?
Well, Chairman, we did tell you. And feeding our future grew because of the pandemic. And
I didn't ask that question. I said, why didn't you tell the truth about why you restarted the payments? The payments stopped because there were concerns, obviously. It wouldn't stop the payments. Then they're restarted a month later. What was the reason for restarting the payments?
my understanding was the agency believed that the court had required them to make those payments.
Democrats on the committee are saying the Trump administration's pause on federal funding is hurting those in real need. They say fraud investigations shouldn't punish those in need. Many of them also using their time to draw attention to immigration enforcement instead of fraud. Alongside the governor, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison also testified. As this is a developing situation, we'll be keeping you updated on the latest information. And the 2026 midterm election season kicked off yesterday with several high-profile primary elections. NTD's Daniel Monahan has the key takeaways.
In Texas, Senator John Cornyn has been pushed into a runoff against Attorney General Ken Paxton in the state's Republican Senate primary, one of yesterday's most closely watched races.
The statewide early results are in, and we did very well, as expected, and we were on to the runoff.
Cornyn is seeking a fifth term, but facing a tough challenge from Paxton, the state attorney general. He hopes to avoid becoming the first Republican senator in Texas history not to be renominated. Although Cornyn has expressed occasional skepticism of President Trump, he has been a reliable ally to the president. Paxton, however, says he is more aligned with Trump's Make America Great Again movement. President Trump didn't endorse either candidate during the primary, but the results may raise pressure on him to take a side. The two will meet in a head-to-head contest on May 26th. On the Democratic side, the Associated Press declared State Representative James Tallarico the winner over Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in Texas's closely watched Democratic Senate primary. He'll face the winner of the runoff between Cornyn and Paxton. The Tallarico campaign stressed the unprecedented numbers of young voters, independent and Republicans supporting his campaign.
We are not just trying to win an election. We are trying to fundamentally change our politics.
Some voting uncertainty occurred in the contest. A Dallas County judge extended Democratic polling hours to 9 p.m. after early confusion left some voters turned away. Just before the extension ended, the Texas Supreme Court blocked the order, saying voting must proceed as permitted. U.S. Representative Crockett criticized the situation.
But I can tell you now that people have been disenfranchised. The reason that we knew that there were problems is because we were receiving the phone calls and the emails.
In a major Republican primary upset, CNN's Decision Desk projects that Texas State Representative Steve Toth will defeat Congressman Dan Crenshaw in the race for Texas's 2nd Congressional District. Crenshaw, a 4-term congressman and former Navy SEAL, faced criticism from the conservative wing of his party despite his ties to President Trump. His backing the resettlement of Afghani refugees and vote to certify the 2020 election results put him at odds with key MAGA supporters. Senator Ted Cruz endorsed Toth and appeared in a super PAC ad backing the challenger. And the November matchup for the U.S. Senate race in North Carolina is set, with Republican Michael Whatley and Democrat Roy Cooper facing off. Whatley won the GOP primary with about 64% of the vote, while Cooper secured the Democratic nomination. The winner will succeed Senator Tom Tillis, who chose not to run for re-election. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
Coming up, the UN's nuclear watchdog says it hasn't detected any damage to Iran's nuclear facilities. The agency's head urges maximum restraint to help prevent a radiological incident. An Asian man attacks a volunteer from a faith group in broad daylight in New York City. Behind the violence is the CCP's ongoing persecution that's been targeting that spiritual practice for more than 25 years. The UN's nuclear watchdog says it hasn't detected any damage to Iran's nuclear facilities. The agency added there was currently no risk of radiation. Officials remain in contact with nuclear safety regulators in the Middle East. According to the organization, a nuclear power plant in the United Arab Emirates and research reactors in Jordan and Syria are operating normally. The head of the agency reiterated calls for restraint after several countries in the region had been attacked, including Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. He warned that all of those nations use nuclear applications in some capacity and urged maximum restraint to help avoid any danger of radiological incident. Meanwhile, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez is calling for an end to escalating violence in the Middle East. Here's the Prime Minister giving a televised address today.
Nobody
knows for sure what will happen now. Neither are the objectives for the first attack at all clear. But we have to be prepared for the possibility of this war spilling over, and that there might be very serious consequences in world economic terms. The position of Spain in this situation is clear and consistent. It is the same position as we adopted for Ukraine and Gaza. First, we are against the breakdown of international order, which protects all of us, especially the most vulnerable, the civilian population. And secondly, the world's problems cannot be solved by conflict and bombing. And finally, we cannot repeat the mistakes of the past. The position of the Spanish government can be summarized in these words: no to war.
Spain says its military bases are not being used in the U.S. operation against Iran. President Trump said yesterday he ordered Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to cut trade ties with Spain, accusing Spain of blocking U.S. forces from using its bases. Spain hosts 2 joint U.S.-Spanish military bases. They operate under a bilateral defense agreement and support NATO missions. And London police have arrested 3 men suspected of spying for China. The suspects were detained in London and Wales for allegedly assisting a foreign intelligence service in violation of the country's National Security Act. These arrests come amid growing concerns about Chinese espionage and political interference in the UK. The UK security service MI5 warned last year that Chinese agents have made targeted and widespread efforts to recruit lawmakers and others. It says they've used LinkedIn and cover companies. Beijing denies the allegations. Security Minister Dan Jarvis has expressed alarm over what he calls an increasing pattern of covert activity from Chinese state-linked actors targeting UK democracy. Back to the United States now, where violence against a faith group on the streets of New York City is raising concern. Just a couple days ago, video footage shows an Asian man assaulting a woman in Flushing, New York, while she was distributing flyers to call for an end to China's persecution of her faith. Security camera footage shows a man who appears to be Asian striking the woman, knocking her to the ground and running away. The woman's hat and glasses fell off during the assault. The attacker's face was recorded, and now police are investigating the incident. The woman was distributing flyers hoping to raise awareness of the ongoing persecution in China against her faith, Falun Gong or Falun Dafa, and calling on people to quit the Chinese Communist Party and its affiliated organizations. Falun Gong practitioners have been engaging in nonviolent demonstrations against that persecution for over 25 years. Stay with us. We'll have more coverage of the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran in the next hour, and we'll be broadcasting the White House press briefing right after this break.